Hey everyone. So what I want to do here is walk you through the framework that I created and the survey results that are meant to sort of validate that there's a consensus around this framework. So I'm just going to jump right in. The framework itself is meant to assess quote unquote harmful speech, right? Harmful doesn't mean it's like everyone agrees it's harmful, but somebody does, and sort of like exploring that. It's meant to be a sort of diagnostic to determine what I think is critical, which is like understanding if there was intent or indifference to cause that harm, but also providing that open door, a key principle of mind for somebody to sort of correct, clarify, and then repair if they did cause harm. And so the four principles, that's just like a little bit of a reminder that I have for restoring these moral taboos. The first one is the red line. We're really focusing these like moral taboos that I talk about. Overt hateful bigotry includes a dehumanization and the endorsement of violence. The consensus test, this has to be something that it's not subjective. It's not like one or two or small group of people sort of like, oh, I was offended by that one thing. It's something that most people, right? Like the vast majority will agree this is a moral violation. This is, on a principled way is wrong no matter what. The third one is the private mechanism. So I love the First Amendment. It's really important. This is nothing to do with legal consequences, only social consequences through civil society. And then the last one, maybe the most important one, is the open door. We're not trying to permanently cancel and punish and ostracize people out of polite society forever. The goal is to basically correct, right? To say this is behavior that we do not accept and always give people a path back to redemption. So the most common question I get when I sort of like talking about all of this is who defines bigotry? Like what is that bigotry and who gets to define it? And it's a really valid and really important question. And that's what this framework is meant to sort of address. So at a high level, what the framework does is it's meant to evaluate this speech through a 4-stage process based on again, that sort of harm, the intent to harm, and then their attempt at repairing it. And so the first step is the initiating action. What did the person say or do that caused harm to somebody, and really trying to understand their intent to harm from that. The second stage is the initial social consequence as a result, right? Somebody said this thing, people around them respond, shaming them, criticizing them, being really mad, whatever that is, there's some initial consequence. Now, this is the critical part. The third one is the speaker then gets a chance to respond to that. And what they do is really going to be very consequential. And so they can sort of say, I won't clarify what I meant, or I'm not going to apologize. I did mean this thing. They could sort of like validate that they did have intent to cause harm or were indifferent to the harm that they were potentially causing. Or they can sort of clarify. They can apologize, and they can sort of take steps towards active repair that would actually mitigate the social consequences. And that's what happens. So the fourth step is like, what are the augmented social consequence after their follow-up response? And so that severity of the fallout really is dependent on that. So whether they're going to apologize or whether they're not going to apologize, whether they're going to clarify or not. And, I know here, like the open door means that they can always come back, right? They can say, like, they can be like, no, I don't care. I'm a jerk. They can be harmed. I feel it's bad things. And then one day they can come back and say, actually, I recant that. I realize how wrong I was. And so, yeah, the whole framework, it's based on the sort of assessing the harm based on the person's apparent intent and or indifference to causing that harm. And then the survey, which I'll follow up with later, or the results on later, will help sort of validate this, because I think there is a broad consensus. There's nuances, and we'll talk about that, but there's a broad consensus on this. So here's the framework. Those 4 steps are at the top: initiating action, initial consequence, the speaker's response, and then the augmented social consequence. Now, what I did here is I took all things that could be called bigotry that I think we hear all the time, and tried to break these out into 4 different groups. Now, you can break these out in different ways. I think there could be other groups added, but for simplicity, I kept it to these 4, and I think it's like pretty good. So at the top, you have overt, vile hatred. somebody is sort of like really, this is the stuff that like no one is really questioning, right? Somebody is saying the worst things and sort of espousing KKK ideology. All of these people are evil and bad and subhuman, and we should do these terrible things to them, right? Like sort of violating liberalism. They shouldn't be treated equally. That's sort of like the worst of the worst. The next one, I call this casual bigotry. It can be grievance, resentment, cruelty. There's a lot of examples here. And this isn't to say it's like good by any means. Like this is not excusing this, but I do think it's different because they're not necessarily signaling here that their intent is for all of the people in a certain group to be harmed, right? They could be saying something that's really socially unacceptable, but it's not still the same level. And there's examples in the survey that we sort of go into. The third one is, I call it observation. And so as opposed to essentialism, which is sort of in that first bucket, which is you're saying like all X people are like blank. They are more crime. They like crime. They're born this way. They have lower IQ. They're whatever that is, like sort of this thing that says like this is inherent in every person in that group. It's a little more of observation. So you're looking at statistics about like a group or a neighborhood or something else, crime or whatever that number is, but you're just, it could be a dog whistle. It could be a lot of things, but based on the initial thing they said, we don't know that. And then the fourth example is jokes. This could be a comedian on stage, or this could be somebody in the office sort of making a joke. And so the person makes that statement, they're probably getting an initial social consequence. It's going to be more severe at sort of the by the tier, right? As you go down, more people will sort of like say that person should definitely face really strong social consequences at the number 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. But then what happens next? Does that person then clarify? Do they apologize? Do they double down? And based on sort of what they do, there you see their social consequence, the augmented one, either go up, right? They're going to face more consequences or sort of the full consequences that are deserved, or they're mitigated. And you say, you know, that doesn't mean you don't get fired from your job. That doesn't mean sort of like people don't want to be your friend anymore. But a lot of people will sort of forgive you for that. And again, to the point, there's always this open door. So you can sort of be canceled, you can face this thing, but there's always an opportunity later. I'm always inspired by Daryl Davis. For those of you that are not familiar, he is a black musician who ended up befriending multiple KKK members and got, I think, over 200 of them to disrobe. And so I think even the people that sort of violate the taboos in the worst, most egregious ways can find their way back to polite society with that right sort of effort to make them repair, and they can sort of be redeemed. Okay, now what I wanted to do, because this is sort of like how I try to see the world, this is like an ideal for me, but I didn't want to impose my sort of morality and views and my grace and everything else in the world. But I want to understand, like, is this how most people already think, feel, and act? And so that was the idea of the survey. Some of you might have taken it. And it's linked here, and I'll sort of link it out. And there's a lot in the appendix where you can go in. But at a high level, it's really just meant as a proof of concept. This is not sort of anything conclusive. I think I have a little over 100 responses. It is meant to validate that there's a directional consensus on sort of that framework. It's not conclusive by any means. I think we would need a further study to see, one, like broader than my personal network, younger people, non-college educated, really to see if like those same trends hold up. There's other nuances that I would sort of add in there as well to make this, I wanted to keep this really simple, but I think there's other sort of examples and nuances, and I'll talk about that at the end, sort of what I would recommend as sort of a phase 2 study and research. Okay, so the full questions are in the appendix and you can sort of link to it, but I'll just sort of give a quick overview. So scenario 1, like a reminder for those that took the survey or for those that didn't. Scenario 1, an employee celebrates the murder of a political influencer. Scenario 1A, he's asked about it, he doesn't apologize. Scenario 1B, he's asked about it and he does apologize. 2 is where the employee says some really like harmful stereotypes. Like I think it's just like classical tropes really not nice. Like almost anyone would agree that's not a good thing to say and do. Scenario 2A, he doesn't apologize. 2B, he does apologize. 3 is the employee just shares, let's say, crime statistics, like sort of doesn't indicate one way or another, isn't indicating that he's trying to be sort of harming any group. In the first one, he sort of refuses to clarify or apologize. She refused to clarify or apologize. And then 3B is clarifies and apologizes. And then the fourth scenario is about a comedian. He's making bigoted jokes. In the first example, the jokes he makes, he refused to sort of like clarify that he doesn't like actually hold those bigoted views against the group, and he's friends with people off stage that sort of like hold these bigoted views. And then scenario 4, it like doesn't match. Like they make these bigoted views about a group on stage, but then in real life they're like hanging out with them. They like sort of denounce hatred and bigotry wherever they can, and so it sort of like doesn't match. I call it like contextual consistency. And then scenario 5, this is like there's only a single one here. It's like the example of a celebrity sponsor like going out and making like some absurdly bigoted statements. This was just like, I don't know, like a test one, I guess, in a sense. I just threw it in there. Okay, so what did we see? It's 4 takeaways, none too surprising, but the first one is across 4 of the scenarios. So I didn't include scenario 3, we'll get into it. 1, 2, 4, and 5. When somebody says something that is like a clear expression of bigotry, and they don't apologize, right? They're given a chance to apologize and they don't apologize or clarify or whatever that is. Most people say that they would, as an employer, they would fire them, or as a fan of that comedian, they would sort of distance themselves. They wouldn't go to their shows anymore. They would disassociate. And so you can see like the pillars on the left, which is like a fire, probably fire. Like most people say that. The takeaway 2 is sort of for each of these scenarios that had an A and a B, when the person did, in the scenario where the person did either clarify their views or apologize, most people agreed to forgive them. Either, not fire them or probably not fire them. Certainly a big shift. People are going to be much more likely to extend some grace to somebody when they apologize or clarify their views. This is takeaway 3. This is an interesting one. The ambiguity like had some mixed views. And so in that scenario 3A, where they shared some crime statistics, and then they were asked, they're like, hey, some people were offended. They thought it was like, harmful that you said that. The person that chooses, if that speaker says, well, I don't care what they thought, right? Like, it's fine. I just shared some stats. If they're offended by it, like that's their problem. There were actually a lot of people that were forgiving of that. You can see on the left here, there were a lot of people like on number 4 and 5, which is don't fire, probably don't fire. There's some people that say like, you know what, like take them at their word. They didn't say anything harmful. They shouldn't have to apologize. They shouldn't have to clarify. They said what they said. And so there's a mix here. Some people said like, no, they should have to apologize or clarify, and some didn't. And again, so much nuance here, but I thought that was interesting. And I think it could make sense, certainly. And then the last one is about the comedian. And so what was interesting is in 4A, the comedian says these bigoted jokes about one group, doesn't apologize, doesn't clarify, seems to like kind of hold those bigoted views or be friends with those, people who hold those bigoted views off stage. Most people say like, stop going to their shows, stop supporting them. I wouldn't recommend them. What's interesting is that in 4B, where the person does clarify, does, say like, no, I don't hate those people. Yeah, I was just joking. They're friends with a lot of people like that off stage. There's still a lot of people are sort of more forgiving. They're like, okay, that's fine. He's a comedian. That's what his job is. Like push the line, push those taboo topics, things like that. But there's still some people, the sizable amount, that said like, I'm not going to go to the shows anymore. Like, that's it. Like he's done for me. They're sort of less forgiving, even when the jokes don't match, which, that's fine. Everyone has sort of freedom of association, of course. And I think it's really interesting. And obviously the way that these are phrased, this is like, is somebody only making fun of that one group versus they're making fun of a lot of groups? And I did talk about like one group. And so I think it's, understandable that some people would be more sensitive, especially if it was their group and a comedian was almost exclusively just attacking them. So those are the takeaways. The sort of like matches the initial conclusions I have. Like, you can, most people, most respondents, most people are going to be forgiving and not try to impose stronger social consequences if somebody clarifies or apologizes. My sort of takeaway is like, we should extend grace. We should allow for that clarification apology. That's part of the framework, but we can't let it turn into this like suicidal empathy, right? If there's more contextual consistency, the person sort of maybe like repeat offenses and things like that, we have to sort of like draw a line somewhere and not let somebody cause harm just because they're sort of like on that line. But that it's really messy and tricky. So this isn't sort of like some universal, but I think a lot about this like suicidal empathy. We can extend empathy and grace, but only up until a point. Somebody's going to have to really come back to that other side to show that they're not trying to cause harm. They're working hard to not cause harm. And then, the last one is just like that open door. I think like always leaving that open door for somebody to repair the harm that they caused. Okay, and then the last thing really quickly, if there's a phase 2, and hopefully there will be, there's probably some things that can be done to make this much more robust, bigger sample size, more representative. I think collecting additional demographic data would be really helpful. So like understanding if Black respondents would assess bigotry against Blacks differently than the same question about Jews. There's a lot to sort of understand about potential hypocrisy or people sort of like, sort of the tribalism, which is natural, but it's not good. And so we want to try to get to a little bit more of that universal standard and seeing if that sort of lives there. There's a lot more nuances here in thinking about bigotry against groups for their immutable traits, so their race, their ethnicity, their gender, versus their beliefs. So like a Republican, right? Like somebody that belongs to has an association with some group that they sort of make themselves, and then are people more forgiving of bigotry for the latter versus the former. Exploration of like bigotry versus the endorsement of violence is an interesting one. There was something unique here, but it was really small that jumped out. There's subtler bigotry, like dehumanizing language. I think this would probably be really hard to explore without like a huge sample size, but it would be really interesting. And then sort of to that point earlier is like the potential bigotry. Do people think about it differently if they perceive, not based on tribal in versus out group, but do they see that group as powerful or oppressed, right? That's sort of, in some way. And are people going to be more forgiving of bigotry against those powerful groups versus somebody they deem as to be sort of a powerless or an oppressed group? And so I think those would all be really interesting sort of things to dive deep on and probably get a lot more information on. It would need probably a different format of the survey, but if somebody wants to explore that, I'm more than happy to. I hope this was helpful and useful, and I look forward to seeing sort of like more conversations and questions and everything else off of this. So thank you, and we will talk soon and keep exploring and trying to make taboos taboo again. Thank you.